So now that we are done with the most important annotations, let's quickly just breeze through the rest of them, and we may not want to go into details of each one of them at this point because we will explore a lot about these annotations as we go into the training, right? So let's just start with the few with respect to the request and response, right? So you see this at the rate request mapping over here, right? So this is basically to define the REST endpoint URIs, right? This is actually an old annotation, but it is still in business. Certain teams would still be using request mapping, and inside the request mapping annotation, they would specify whether it's a post request or a get request or a put request, and we'll discuss what each of these are, right? Basically, these are with respect to the HTTP methods that we are using in those APIs, right? So request mapping is the annotation that is used to define the endpoint, right? And similarly, request param is another annotation. So when it's a get endpoint, let's say, right, we are just fetching some information from a service. That's when we use a get endpoint. You might want to filter the data based on certain parameters. Let's say I'm trying to fetch all the students that belong to a certain department, right? Or a certain, yeah, I mean, let's say department for that matter, right? So in the request that I have, I will pass an extra parameter which says, give me all the students, give me a list of students where the department name equal to chemistry for that matter, right? So that becomes a request parameter, which is most likely going to be used to filter the data out, right? We also have something called a request body. Again, we'll see that when we start doing more coding videos, right? So we also have something called a request body, wherein if we are trying to enroll a new student onto the database, right, then all that student information will come as part of the request body, right? So these are a few requests, and we also have something called a response status. So like I said, there will be a lot many annotations that we will use. Uh, we just have a limited time and space to basically explore all of them at this point, but we will definitely learn a lot about these annotations as we go along, right? So quickly moving on to the right side, right? So again, at the rate bean is an annotation that even existed in the Spring framework. So if you remember, I had told that in the previous videos that if we want to override a certain configuration, right, what do we need to do, right? So basically what we'll do is we will create a bean. And how do we create a bean, right? We will create a function that returns that particular configuration class, right? When I say configuration class, I basically mean the class that needs that configuration, right? It could be a service class, it could be any class that basically needs those configurations, right? And I will instantiate that class inside a method, and I will inject the overriding configuration. And don't worry if you cannot visualize that right now. Uh, we will do that as part of the video, but this is basically the bean annotation, at the rate bean annotation that we will use to basically create our own custom beans, right? Not the default ones that are available as part of the Spring library. But if we want to create custom beans, then we will use the at the rate bean annotation. And these beans will be created inside a at the rate configuration class, right? So just to remember something, that we will most likely be creating these beans inside a configuration class. The next one is at the rate auto wired. So as you would imagine, right, we would need to call the service class from the controller layer, right? There is a at the rate REST controller and there is a at the rate service. So we would want to call the at the rate service class from at the rate REST controller class, right? which means the service class instance needs to be available inside the REST controller for me to be able to call the service class. Now, how do I make this service class instance available inside the REST controller? I'll do that using the @auto_wire annotation, right? This is basically telling Spring Boot that before instantiating the REST controller instance, please try to find a service instance that the REST controller has as part of the auto wiring, right? So when a service controller instance is created, a service instance will be injected into it, right? And we will talk about injection as well for a brief while in the later video, right? So this is basically used to inject instances of one class into the other class, right? I hope that is clear. The next one is @required annotation. So this is again basically telling Spring Boot that please do not instantiate a class unless all the dependencies are resolved, all the instances required by this class are resolved. So let's say, and this can even go to a single POJO for that matter, right? Let's say I have a student object, right? And I have student name as an attribute or as a field inside the student object, right? And I mark the student name as a required field, which means that when I'm trying to register a student, if the student name is found missing in the request body, then it will throw an error saying a mandatory field is missing, right? It will not be able to create a student object without that required field called student name, right? So this is where we will utilize the @required annotation, right? Next is @qualifier annotation, right? So this, as we know, Java is an object-oriented programming language, right? And we have classes that implement interfaces, right? And in implementation, and there can be multiple implementation of one interface, right? So if I have @autowired and I have given an interface name under it, then there can be multiple implementations of that interface on the class path, right? So that creates a confusion for Spring Boot. Now, Spring Boot doesn't know which implementation should be injected with the @auto_wide annotation. So that's where @qualifier comes into play, right? So along with @autowired, we will put a @qualifier wherein we specify which implementation do we want to be injected or basically plugged in to that particular class, right? I hope that is clear, and we'll again see them in the coding workshops that we will do at a later point in time. But basically, qualifier basically qualifies, right, as the name implies, which specific implementation of that interface needs to be injected in that @autowire annotation, right? So that's auto qualifier. Let's move into the next one, which is the @lazy, right? So lazy, again, as the name suggests, basically delays the instantiation. So what it does is, let's say I have a student object, right, that I'm fetching from the database, and inside the student object, I have a list of subjects as well, right? And when I'm fetching the student object, I may or may not be interested in fetching the subjects because subjects might be a different uh, table in the database, right? So I do not want it to be fetched unless I explicitly request the subjects of the student. So that's where @lazy will come into play, right? If we annotate the subjects list of subjects with @lazy, what Spring Boot does is it will not fetch the subjects for every student. It will just fetch the student data. Only when, let's say, the UI application requests for the subjects of each student, that is when it goes and fetches the subject information, right? So in a way, it delays the fetching of that uh, particular object, right? So, and it is considered more efficient in that sense that you don't end up making too many calls, right? If the subject's call is not required, it helps you in completely bypassing that database call, right? So I hope lazy is clear as well. Let's move on to some of the testing annotations that we will see quite often when we are writing test cases, right? So one of them is the Spring Boot test, right? Now this is again coming for free when you create a Spring Boot microservice, and it basically emulates how an application starts, right? And you can so this is considered a very heavy test case, right? And it should be used only when you want to test the entire functionality from the controller layer going into the service layer, even saving and fetching data from the database. That is when we should be using a Spring Boot test. Otherwise, we should stick to testing only the layer that we're testing, right? We'll see a lot many annotations which will test only the controller layer, and we will mock the service layer. So that brings me to the next two annotations where we basically mock the behavior of a certain layer, right? So let's say I'm writing the test cases for the service layer. In that case, I don't have to actually instantiate the repository layer. What I'll do is I'll just mock the repository layer, and I'll tell the testing framework that when I make a request to the database with some parameters, let's say X, I'm expecting a response and let's say Y. So without actually making a database call, the service layer will mock the repository layer, right? So both these annotations are around using a mocking framework basically to mock, because our intention is only to test a certain layer and not the entire functionality, right? So we'll look at the testing pyramid as well, wherein we'll see how the testing needs to be done. Like where do we need to focus more on, whether we should write more of test unit tests, whether we should write more of integration tests. So we'll look a lot of these, we'll look at a lot of different testing methodologies, and that's where we will look at all these annotations once again, and we'll look at how we do test driven development um, as we develop a Spring Boot application, right? But for now, I think we have captured enough number of annotations to get started with the actual coding exercises.